So what I'm going to do today is just very quickly start off with, a kind of remembering the basics about sex and gender in sociology. It's really kind of first year stuff just to kind of get us going again about this, because I haven't really looked at this aspect of like a contour of inequality such as gender and sex in the course yet. I've mostly been looking at more material stuff.
Sure.
And particularly around Bourdieu and symbolic stuff, and been using mostly class examples rather than gender and racial examples, which we'll be touching upon over the next few weeks. So, just to kind of remember back to first year, which was probably a couple of years ago for you guys, remember that the idea of sex relates more to the biology and nature side of things in that nature-nurture debate that you would have looked on back then, and gender pertains more to cultural and what would be the nurture aspects of that massively oversimplistic way of putting gender in nature and nurture. So you would think back then we would have been linking them together as associated behaviours semantically, the way that different meanings are produced around those discourses that link semantically but also semiotically to the various signs and symbols and myths that are created around the gender binary. And particularly around the notions of abnormal and normal, for those that I can remember back to Foucault and the way that kind of the power knowledge discourse there. Culturally, particularly in the West, we have this kind of male active, female passive kind of cultural norms there in inverted commas, obviously, but these binaries leave out a whole lot of stuff around gender and sexuality that's kind of deemed in that Foucauldian sense abnormal. Homosexuality, transgender, female sexual aggression, whatever. So the sociological position here is essentially those binaries are largely useless to understand the complex nature of gender in contemporary society, but we tend to kind of analyse these things in wider conditions such as what we call patriarchy, the rule of society by older men there, which is also important in terms of the generational stuff we were talking about earlier in the course, and within the world of capitalism, where increasingly things like desire, emotion, personal relationships are commodified. And, think about this through, I don't know, Facebook, or is it Ashley Madison, and
Yep.
sites like that. And what we'll be looking at, I'm pretty sure from memory, next week in week 10, through digital and technology, where through the ideas of immaterial and effective labour.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the body is my area of research, and it sort of cuts in between sex and gender, really, in terms of how the body is produced and how appearance is seen to, the way people produce their appearance and want to look is usually aligned to the gendered self they want to present to the world. So this is extremely complex, though, so it will usually move between these binaries in ways that the binaries are not very useful for actually explaining, analysing what's going on, but people anchor them to try to produce recognisable selves, which is something they'll be talking about.
Okay. And so, in the same way, I suppose what you're kind of relating that to is that kind of those binaries. I've touched earlier in the course on very briefly on the idea of self and social identity, and the way that these kind of almost polarities that we think about ourselves in relation to others, in relation to ourselves, to construct our identity.
Exactly. Yeah. So I argue that the self, one of the key ways that the self is produced is through bodywork practices, which are always have gendered elements to them in terms of being recognisable and people deliberately choosing things or not. People also play with these things too. But I'll be able to show you some examples of how that looks.
So Raewyn Connell is a really influential figure in the study of gender in Australia. I'm sure, if you're doing 30 sociology, you've come across Connell's concepts already in this realm. The notion of hegemonic masculinity. This is the kind of that, embodied gendered cultural myths of the hero, the warrior, the leader, the stud, and that kind of stuff. Strong cultural, social pressures here for males to kind of achieve that presentation of self. And Connell also talks about emphasised femininity. I think, again, there's kind of cultural myths surrounding that kind of stuff. So we can think of these in some ways as collective fantasies that we're kind of exposed to from an early age in socialisation, from silly stereotypic examples of boys getting Tonka trucks and girls getting Barbies and all that kind of socialisation stuff that I'm sure by third year you've well and truly come across a lot. Now, certainly in pop culture, these things are omnipresent, but they're increasingly toyed with and used in various kind of notions of reflexivity and irony. And I suppose, though, in terms of sexism, that irony often plays back to what I was talking about in previous weeks about hipster sexism and the way that sexism itself is reconfigured differently in different eras, I suppose. A really influential gender theorist, probably the most influential. I don't really want to rank anyone here, but I
would say that.
Yeah, Judith Butler is immensely influential when thinking about the problematic nature of these binaries, but also the way, in a way that what Julia was touching on a minute ago, the way that gender is somewhat of a performance, where these kind of roles are provided for us, and we kind of learn the lines and we play those roles, but there's also plenty of room to kind of toy with the script, I suppose, and not necessarily take up that hegemonic masculinity role or emphasise femininity and play around with it somewhat. Another really important study, kind of a really canonical text in youth studies, is Anita Harris's Future Girl that came out in 2004 from memory, and she's actually doing a second edition of this where it's being updated as we speak. And Anita back then was kind of writing about what she called Future Girl, and again drawing together stuff that we've looked at earlier in the course. She sketched out these figures of the can-do girl and the at-risk girl, and of different ways to think about the way that gender affects the domains of education, employment, civics, welfare, culture, industries, and the like. And you can think about, again, that kind of at-risk notion that I was talking about with Peter Kelly's work earlier on in the course. So there's quite a bit of detail on that slide. I won't go into that too much now because we haven't got heaps of time to do that. And just lastly, before I let Julia talk about her own research, I just wanted to touch upon kind of some, mainstream media, popular cultural issues where a lot of the stuff that I've talked about already, and then that Julia will be touching upon, kind of, resonates with some of the theories and concepts that we're talking about. So, gender and sexuality and risk has been a really kind of central area of study in youth studies, pertaining to moral panics and also about opportunities and stuff like that as well. And certainly in the area of pop culture and cultural studies, pop music in particular has been a really key site of object here to look at the different issues that we're talking about. There was a whole kind of industry in the late 80s, early 90s in cultural studies writing about Madonna, for instance, and fashion and sexuality and that kind of stuff. More recently, particularly in popular media and kind of some important blogs, there's lots of debates around, whether Beyonce's a feminist and whether what Taylor Swift kind of contributes to those kind of relationships and stuff as well. Same with TV shows, and it seems to happen almost generationally again. Sex in the City to Girls to Broad City, and there's all kinds of positioning around these kind of things. And again, I'd like to think about these things in some ways like the hipster and bogan in terms of the struggles that happen in the field of representation around different forms of politics. There's a whole lot of work, both in the popular realm and in academia, about the meaning of porn, whether it's an expression of increased female sexual freedom or whether it's a continuation of exploitation. Where nudity itself is being increasingly used as a form of politics, and I've got some links there to Femin, most people I think would be somewhat familiar with that, and the Australian actress Caitlin Stacey has started a kind of feminist, is it a magazine or blog?
Blog, I think, or a website.
Yeah, that's kind of using imagery to, I suppose, go against the grain of this subjective nature of the way women's bodies are presented in a lot of pop culture, taking back control. There's debates around, again, relating back to Britney Spears and Spice Girls about raunch culture and all that kind of stuff, girl power. And more recently, you've been writing, you wrote a blog about the moral panic around Boner Garage that I've linked up to as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we move on, or are you going to talk about that later?
Oh, it's kind of linked in with the risk understandings of young people, and particularly young women, how they present their bodies, and how that tends to be a very narrow space of so-called freedom that is acceptable way of presenting yourself, or,
Yeah.
or you'll be seen as, at risk of victimization by the, all the young men who can't have any other good intentions.
Yeah.
And sort of the way that normalizes particular forms of gendered violence, actually,
Yep.
and the expectations around that being the way that young men and women will interact, will have those power dynamics built into them automatically from the way that adults speak about them.
Yep.
Importantly, it's the framing of them that's important.
So do you think the moral panics around the presentation of sexuality are generational in that sense? It seems to me that the same concerns come up, a decade apart kind of thing, and it's just a lot of the same moral and value kind of judgments around just a different kind of aesthetic.
In a way, I think that those things repeat around, young people today.
Yeah.
And those kind of generational judgments that are made.
So it goes from Elvis shaking his hips, being not allowed to be on TV, to kind of Nicki Minaj videos.
Well, sexualization of young people has been a concern for, like decades and decades, but the form it takes changes, particularly with social media, and there are, legitimate concerns about what that means in terms of gender politics in the context we have. But there's obviously the risk of reinscribing the same kinds of inequalities in the language we use, and what we assume young men and women will do based on what adults will think they will do, based on young people's own, rather than based on what young people actually do and how they actually negotiate.
Yeah, so basing kind of judgments about what people do in their real lives also based on the photos they present on Facebook, which is, a presentation of a mediated self that doesn't necessarily relate to what people do.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've pointed out a lot of kind of female examples there, but there's also a lot of, very interesting stuff about gender and masculinity. Again, in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, there was work around the metrosexuality. Was this an opportunity for males to express their kind of female side, or was it just really good marketing to sell cosmetic products to the other 50% of the population? A lot of stuff recently about masculinity and violence and alcohol consumption and things like that. And certainly, just very generally around youth and homosexuality, there's studies that kind of point out that young people seem to be more accepting of homosexuality compared to previous generation, but also the key kind of drivers of discrimination and the victims of discrimination as well. So look, I'm touching on a whole lot of stuff there that actually deserves their own lectures in a way.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about those before we move on?
No, just there's plenty of just the sheer volume of stuff that is in the media on issues of gender and sexuality in youth, I see has really increased over the last few years. I feel like we're having a particular moment with it at the moment, which is exciting. And the way that the sort of discussions are being had publicly around what is a feminist, they weren't around when I was in undergrad. It was, I remember my tutor asking, does anyone identify as a feminist? And it was a really almost taboo thing, and I was one of the only people who raised my hand. So I feel like the space for discussion has shifted, and popular culture has a lot to do with that, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. I think, so what I was talking about there was a lot of discussion about what feminism is, but it seemed to be back quite academic and elite, even not even academic, but maybe in kind of journals and magazines and stuff like that around figures. But it seems those debates today are happening more directly about the politics itself.
Yeah.
Even the very existence of something like the Daily Life on Sydney Morning Herald would have been kind of unthinkable a decade ago. Yeah.
And I do think the existence of news media technologies like social media, particularly Twitter, which has its particular way of interacting with people, has led to a more sort of grassroots kinds of discussions that means it's not limited to academic things, and people are able to comment more broadly, and things get taken up because of the way social media works. So it's a particular combination of factors that are working in interesting ways with feminism, I think, and discussion.
And the thing I just realised I left off there that I meant to put on was Gamergate and things like that around all that kind of stuff. And that are actually really good examples of the way that social media affords that political discussion, but then the kind of, in a way, the reactionary politics that kind of springs out against it. Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of the broad introduction to, again, as I said, we could probably do a whole course around that.
Yep.
That's fired right there.
Yep.
Be a bloody good course, actually.
It would.
While I think about
Although
it.
we'd have to update it every week.
Yeah,
and there'd be no guaranteed content.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is hand it over more to Julia and let her talk about her research around body work, gender and risk. I'll just kind of chime in every now and then and ask the odd question or for clarification, whatever.
Sure. So just to sort of map the space I'm working in relation to, youth culture and risk, which is the course. One of the key arguments I've made in relation to this research is that one of the only ways the body is often present in youth studies or youth research, certainly not youth studies only, but in terms of health or the way young people are looked at, is in relation to their bodies being a source or a site of risk that have to be managed. So in relation to sexuality or sexualization, the bodies are at risk of being corrupted, particularly young women's bodies being corrupted by, boys up to no good and or men. Also to do with obesity as being a growing, health risk and drug and alcohol use, but also body image. So all the kind of key concerns that are seen as being young people concerns tend to be bodily.
Yeah. So just by body image there.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more what you mean about that? So I instantly think of things like anorexia and stuff like that, but I also think of the use of young sexualized bodies to sell stuff.
Yeah.
So is that the kind of broad area you're talking about in terms of when you say body image? Is that what it means?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm really thinking of the fact that the Mission Australia studies every year have young people themselves rate body image as something that they are most concerned about, along with, like, it's in the top 3 for young men and women between 18 and 24 for the last 5 years running.
Okay.
So by that means it includes things like eating disorders, but it also includes things like, are you worried about how you look? Do you spend time worrying about it? Like, do you feel bad about it?
Yeah.
So it's much broader than being, diagnosed with having some kind of disorder, definitely.
You just tell me when you need to move along with it.
Sure. Yeah. You can move on now. So as I was just sort of getting at there, these are kind of the key ways that the body tends to be seen, and I'm starting to make a theoretical point here. It's seen as something that has to be managed by young people themselves to avoid the pitfalls associated with whether it's body image issues or, negative images in the media of narrow, perfect bodies type thing. It's also seen as being, many of these things particularly gendered in terms of young women having to manage them, and that's sort of demonstrated by the kinds of images on the screen here and the fact that the image of the boys, I don't know if you can read it, but it says men are less likely to seek treatment for eating disorders because of the perception that they are women's disorders. Lots of these things are seen as relating specifically to women, but that can exclude discussion for young men who are, and we know they are, experiencing body image concerns as a top 3 as well. And also, I'm really interested in researching health too, and the kinds of bodily responsibilization of health, but it not being really health as an experience, but as how it looks. And that's with all, again, social media, to do with Fitspo, all of those, bloggers that are, only really around at the moment for the first time. We haven't seen this before. And the kinds of discourses around, being self-responsible, choosing to have a particular body if you just would work hard enough. All those sorts of things. And the theoretical point I want to make is we usually see these kinds of risks being, or discourses, pressures being inscribed on bodies, so the text on that body there, that's often how we sort of theorise what happens to young people or to bodies when they come into contact with, say, gender relations, media images. They're seen as sort of mapping onto the body and causing, all kinds of ill things. But the approach I want to sketch out next, I'll just briefly go through sort of the context, but I'll sketch out the theory in a minute, tries to get beyond that kind of bodily inscription, body as a passive receptor of social norms and processes. So the context I'm looking at in this study, which I'll go on to explain, is looks at the gender, health, image, and consumer culture kind of norms or contexts that shape what body image or body work practices, how the body is seen for young people at the moment. So what is going on in this context is that there's been a huge rise in the health and fitness and beauty industries since the 1970s, but particularly spiked in the 80s, 90s, and is still kind of growing exponentially. Accompanied with this has been shifts or pushes in public health towards addressing lifestyle, so-called lifestyle diseases like obesity, and try and encourage people to do more exercise and eat more healthily, which I'm not saying I have a problem with those things, but the discourses that surround them are usually image or often image-based and quite victim-blaming. And I'm interested also in the ways that gender differences are seen to be naturally apparent on the body and are then emphasised as being, I look opposite to a man because I'm a woman, and how those things are deliberately played up and emphasised in the kinds of body work that people do. So to be more muscular, or to try to be more muscular as a man, or to try to be more slender is the binary. It can be seen as being retraditionalising these types of differences in the context that gender has lots of other dynamics have shifted a lot to do with the participation of women in work, in education, in the public sphere, and a response, some sociologists argue, to those changes has been a reinscription of the opposing bodily shapes that are produced by men and women to kind of carve out those differences, where in real life there's not many differences that we need anymore in terms of the kind of labour that people do.
So are you saying that that's the kind of return of that is almost like a disciplinary technique that is against the perceived freedoms that have happened?
Yeah, well, so I think, I'm not sure if I've got a slide on it coming up, but I think it's either Schilling or Crossley that argues that a key reason that we're seeing the rise in men wanting to have more visible muscular shapes is a response to more women being in the public sphere and sort of carving out difference again. So that is a form of regulation, and that plays into the norms again, or recreates them. So I won't go into heaps of detail in the theoretical approach, because if you're interested in following this up, obviously the first paper, the first reading is much more theoretical than the first, so you can follow up what these concepts really mean. But just to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about the body in this, I think it's particularly important because the body is sort of, you come to it already in a binary, because it's, the Cartesian mind-body binary is seen as sort of the structuring foundational binary that then goes on to inform how you think about the body's relationship with society. That actually implicitly informs so much of sociology previously. It's been addressed in the past couple of decades.
So just to touch on that, the Cartesian thing there is I think, therefore I am. And that is that dualism implies that there's a separation between mind and body. They're two separate things. So an example of this would be that, when you see a footballer after the game get asked how he went and how he's feeling, he'll say, I'm pretty good, but the body is struggling at this start of the season. So that is a kind of norm that we kind of distinguish those two things. So that's what you mean by the Cartesian dualism.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do speak about our minds and bodies being separate. It's not about not doing that. It's just about we don't look at the body in its own right as being like, how is what it does important for understanding social processes. So because of sort of that problem, which is a big philosophical problem that has been around for a while, I needed to sort of make sure I thought through that properly and all the implications that would have for how I understood people working on their bodies, because I didn't want to, come out with saying, well, people have cosmetic surgery because they don't understand what they're doing, and if we could only teach them all not to, then they wouldn't want to do it anymore, or
Right.
the kind of false consciousness stuff.
Yeah, so I was just going to say,
Yeah.
because we've looked at
Have you?
we've looked at
Great.
Frankfurt School earlier. Yeah, so you didn't want to render people without any
No,
agency and
yeah,
just being
exactly.
some kind of
Passive dupe.
capitalist kind of narcissistic dupe.
Yeah. Or particularly, this is kind of can be particularly problematic in feminism as well, because the tendency to see people who sort of deliberately self-objectify,
Yeah.
or do things that feminists might deem to be oppressive, then
It's been being rendered as like the patriarchal bargain.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Then it tends to see that people are just sort of automats that kind of don't have any. You need to see the tactics and the reasons that these things are being used, and how the body is active in that process instead of just being sort of an appendage in the process. To the mind, exactly, an appendage to the mind, and getting past that kind of passive culture writes norms and meanings onto you, and you just simply live them out. Whereas we all engage with these things critically, so it's much more complex to try to explain why people do things if you approach them as critical thinking, embodied people. So that's basically what these concepts and terms try to do. The particular theoretical framework is drawn from the work of people like Deleuze and Guattari, but these concepts and theories have been developed a lot by sociologists and feminist sociologists and philosophers since 1987, in the 90s when this was written. So I'm really hanging a lot of my work off that secondary work that's been done to enable these concepts to be used. I'll let you follow them up. The next slide has some more definitions. But basically, in a nutshell, these concepts in this theory of the body is about trying to see how the body and the social are in constant interplay and feeding back into each other. So it's much more simple than a causal, a causal kind of relationship in terms of social norms, bodily pressures impacting you and then making you do something. That might be a part of it, but there will always be a factor that involves change as well, because these things happen over time. They don't stay the same. And it's about looking at, putting the body as forefront in this discussion to what are the feelings and sensations that go along with social practices, how do they help to motivate action, and how can they be unpredictable? And what can that unpredictable and what can that help us know about our world maybe differently?
Okay, so what Julia's talking about there as well is that I touched upon, I think, when I was talking about hipsters and bogans, how there's been what's called a turn to effect in the past decade or so, where social scientists are increasingly interested in the way that emotions and feelings actually play a role, not just in our own happiness or satisfaction or whatever, but actually kind of how social relations are done with and through, I suppose, from what a better way of put it. Now, I have a particular Bourdieuian perspective of that, where Julia's work and the effect theory more generally is much more influenced by Deleuze.
It is. But I mean, something like an affect like disgust would be a real one that we would cross over on as being understanding, like as motivating action and as speaking to social structures and inequalities very strongly. So
that's a really good example.
So I might move on there, and I'll try to pick out where I'm seeing affect in some of the examples later on to loop back into it, but I'll leave it for there, I think. So my study was, this is one that I did in my PhD in 2010, so it started getting a little bit old, but I'm still getting a lot out of it. I think you'll see it's pretty rich and interesting in terms of the kind of things people told me. So I interviewed 22 men and women, so 11 men, 11 women, aged 18 to 33, who lived in around Melbourne in a whole lot of different suburbs and in a whole lot of different occupations. So mainly they were white and sort of middle class-ish, but they had lots of different education levels and professions. So there were a couple of football players, there was a couple of people who were servers in restaurants, then there were more professional, like design type people, sales representatives, accountants, are kind of all over the shops. Hard to kind of generalise, but they, had all finished school, for example. And I recruited through Facebook to get my friends to help me out to find people. So my key research question, one of them was, how do young people's body work or body work practices and impact on their well-being? And how, a secondary one is, how do bodywork practices connect with identity, and how people were actively trying to create identity through how they presented themselves or their bodies. So as I'll discuss in a minute, these are related to diet, exercise, weightlifting, all kinds of things that people would just come along and tell me about at the time of the interview. I didn't narrow it down to, it could only be people who are at the gym, for example, because I wanted people who didn't go to the gym in my study as well to discuss why not. Not that I asked them why not, because that would infer that they should be. But try to get a broad sample. So defining bodywork in relation to the theory I was just giving you. So I'm using this term to get to the embodied processes that connect individuals and social forces. So that linking in with, how's the body implicated in the world? Influenced by social forces beyond us that we didn't choose. We're born in a particular time and place. But, how they also, speak back into it. And so it's kind of trying to get in between the structure and agency kind of debate that you might have talked about. So on to the next one. The practices of bodywork that people did were pretty varied, although mainly around diet and exercise in particular for men and women. The practices were gendered to the extent that most of the women's practices were described as being geared around being slimming, although lots of them were also about, tone and strength were kinds of words they used that crossed over with the descriptions of the men's practices. But wearing makeup and having cosmetic surgery, only the women were involved in, and trying to actively build muscle or get bigger were the words that only men used.
Did tattooing come up?
Oh yes, tattoo. Sorry, of course. There's tattooing and piercing on there. They did come up quite a bit, and it was a really interesting and important aspect of identity. But I ended up not really being able to follow up on them just because I had so many diverse practices to look at, and there wasn't much to generalise from, other than it was an important sort of form of expression and way that the self was being really deliberately cultivated around particular symbols they wanted to have on their bodies.
Cool.
So some of the key discourses that were involved in the meanings of people's bodywork for themselves, and also for what they saw as bodies should look like for men and women.
And so by that you mean these are the kind of themes that came up from out of the interviews?
These came up from out of the interviews. Gender was certainly central, from all the way from sort of a really binaristic, quite narrow version, which is a man should be a man, which I'll unpack. But other people did also say, I don't think it's attractive for men to have really big muscles. I think, men and women don't actually look that different, and I find anyone attractive. All kinds of things in between, but there are really big implications for heterosexuality of the more narrowed down binaristic understandings of gender, because it's usually around the dynamics of being attractive to the opposite, which I'll look at. Health was the other really key, regulative kind of discourse that was going on in terms of the language they'd use to talk about other people's bodies, particularly people who are overweight, and what that meant for what kind of people they were. So real, that kind of moralising of health and body shapes based on an idea of what health should look like, which I think is highly problematic.
And I think that resonates with what with Dave's work on the moralising around homeless people. How there's So it's just that's a good relation back to the previous work there.
You can move on. So just to get us into this space, and into the space of the interviews, I didn't use these images, but these are images that people sort of describe to me as characteristics of an supposedly ideal body shape by gender. And I sort of deliberately set this up because, well, for one, it's hard to get people to talk about their bodies. I can't just I tried actually to say, do you do anything to change how your body looks? And people didn't know how to answer that. So by asking them to describe what they thought the mainstream was, they would often use that as a jumping off point to discuss what they thought was ideal as being different to that or not. But everyone pretty much knew how to identify what they saw, the sort of what their perception of what other people thought was ideal was, and pretty much represented in these.
So people are reluctant to actually talk about their deliberate practices to change their bodies specifically.
Not when we started talking about others' bodies first. Okay. That's what I found.
Yeah.
So
that's
this
really
is like a tactic. Because then I could say, well, what do you think people have to do to look like that?
Yeah.
And then they'd say, oh, they have to go to diet and exercise all the time, blah, 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 and I can't be bothered doing that.
Yeah.
So do you do anything like that? And that's how you get into that zone, because people don't know what body work is otherwise.
I got this up earlier on, said that Marky Mark photo from the 90s there always reminds me of this very famous Culture Jam.
Yeah.
So that was the Marky Mark ones from the Calvin Klein ads.
Yeah.
And these Culture Jams here from an earlier lecture in first year, I think.
Yeah.
Where they were, bring out the meaning of obsession.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. Thanks.
Move forward.
Yeah. Move forward. So these next examples, or pretty much the rest of them, are around those key themes I talked to you around gender, the way that gender was made apparent in interviews, health, and also individualization.
Yep.
So this example is links to why Sarah's trying to explain to me why it's important for women to take care of their appearance more than men, in her view. And she said it's because guys aren't looked at as much as the girls. It's more important because it's something that people look for. And she said it's just the way it is. It's always been like that. It's just different. Mm-hmm. And then, interestingly, it goes on. She starts mapping, bodily characteristics with gendered traits or supposed, role traits around being sensitive, caring,
soft,
and then tough, dirty, and and it's sort of interesting the dynamics of that. So rude gets in there as well for guys,
right?
And so that kind of shows you the link between it's not just the bodily presentation of things, but it's what they're said to signify. As the broader binaristic, sex-linked gendered characteristics.
That we're talking about at the start.
Yeah. And she did go on in the next, because I asked her, do you know people like this, or is this sort of how you know things to be, or do you know, is it also a bit more complex? She's like, oh no, I don't know people like this.
Yeah. No, it's always really interesting when you're doing interviews that I always have a fear that my participants are giving me what they think I want sometimes. And you have to kind of follow that up to try and get the difference between them talking about the way they think things are or maybe, and then getting to talk about their own lives. Yeah,
exactly, to show the disjuncture and how the binaries aren't that useful. They're useful for generalising, but in terms of actual experiences or reality.
And so it's always a really interesting thing going on there, and we all do it. We talk about stuff through those binaries because they're there as a script for us to use. And so we tend to communicate by starting off with them, even though we don't, believe in them, use them, or whatever in our day-to-day lives. It's an interesting way that communication works. Yeah.
Exactly. So this example sort of relates as well to the gendered scripts or norms that influence why people do body work, or why those norms exist in terms of those, Miranda Kerr and Marky Mark. And Ben is starting to sort of open this up a bit more by saying that, maybe it's not as much for women in terms of pressure on the body and appearance, but it's increasing every year. He thinks on men, more and more pressure to look a certain way. They might hide it a bit more. And he used to be a professional baseballer, so looking the part of being a big, strong man was his words were
Yep.
very important to his identity in the years previous. So he was sort of particularly attuned to this because he was sort of wasn't living that identity anymore as being a
Yep.
baseballer, but yet he was still doing all the bodywork practices, so he still looked like that.
Yep.
So he's particularly aware of it.
Which would be interesting to talk to him when he's in his mid-40s, when that stuff gets harder and harder.
I would love to talk to him again because he was saying, I don't know how I can keep this up.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm 32. That's what he was saying at the time. Yeah. So the next slide.
There's a bravado, insecurity. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's kind of very common masculine traits when they open up and talk about those pressures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as I'll talk about in the next slide as well, the thing about the body pressures norm seen as being feminine or female related by sex and by gender is that it excludes or it makes discussion of it very difficult for men. And that in fact hides or glosses over a whole lot of similarities that are going on in the way people experience their bodies. The contexts of gender, of course, are different, but the actual, and this is how I use affect, the embodied sensations associated with pressure to look a certain way, I think the sensations are the same, but the words and language that is possible is different because of the context. And that's in the way that women and men all said that women were under more pressure than men, which it is broadly true in terms of the kind of numbers of severity of body image and eating disorders. But it is still experienced by men. But men in the study certainly didn't understand it as a collective thing that could be experienced by men. It was something that only, whenever they described it to me, it was, I feel like this, but other men don't really. Ben's example was the furthest they came towards linking it to broader societal kind of context, whereas all the women and men were able to link it to, it's because of the media, it's because of gender norms, whereas that critical aspect of it wasn't there, even though it was experienced by the men, which I thought was interesting. And this example here is around the actual, the process of feeling, well, I call it pressure, I guess, around trying to create an image or thinking this is how I'm supposed to look, this is what I'm supposed to be. Those same terms are used by Kate and Jason. One in relation to fashion television and women's image, so-called, and the male football ideal for Jason. But it's that same kind of process and experience that is not usually acknowledged.
Okay. So the same pressures are felt the same way by the gender, even though the pressures are gendered.
Exactly, and that's, I think, something that the focus on the body can highlight. It's not to gloss over and say, oh, it's the same. Of course, there are always politics involved and there are power dynamics. But it's important to recognise the similarities too, to avoid keeping reinscribing these binaries as though men and women are somehow different species. Okay. So this is still sort of linking in with the kind of pressures aspect and gendered aspects I've been discussing already, but I'm making a bit of an affective reading of this particular example to help explain why it matters, why body work is important to people and why it's so significant for identity. So Gillian's talking about her doing her bodywork practices, which tend to be yoga or jogging, as being her way of breaking out of feeling bad or sad about her body shape, because it enables her to feel attractive if she's doing something. The feeling of being okay only comes from the practice of doing something in her relationship with these practices and with her body. And it's that feeling that I think is motivating the practices, but is also really limiting what is possible for her, because that's the other aspect of the affect framework that's from that Deleuzean perspective, that affect drives what is possible. So if you have Spinoza or Deleuzean reading of this would be that this is a narrow range of affect available that is kind of looped in this cycle of this affect is only possible when this happens. So if I don't go for a run or I don't jog or I don't go to yoga, that's like I don't have any other options for me available to feel good about myself. Whereas an expanded affective relationship with the bodywork practice would be that, or with your body would be that I feel good in a range of ways that don't have anything to do with how I look or don't have as much to do with it, because then I'm not linked into this rigid routine of.
So this is kind of like an effective self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so she runs 10Ks 3 times a week, goes to 2 yoga classes. This is after being on her feet all day in a weight serving job, where she says she's exhausted at the end of it, but won't let herself eat.
Yeah.
So all these kinds of really limiting and quite damaging body practices that I would say have. The main problem with them is what happens if she can't do these things is the spiral of feeling bad.
So does she feel guilty and stuff if she doesn't go through that?
Yeah, well, she says the only way she doesn't feel guilty is if she does all this stuff. Okay. So what happens if she gets injured, for example, or gets sick, as is the case with other participants in the study, a football player, for example, who couldn't train anymore because he got injured and he said he was losing who he was. There are his words. So that's sort of the other way I'm using affect is important, is drawing attention to how the body feels and seeing that is really important to understanding why the practice matters, but also what else it means for what is possible in their lives related to that practice.
Yes. Okay. Now, obviously, from my theoretical perspective, I would be interested in thinking about those things through habitus and bodily hexis and likes of that. I'm just flagging those to the course, to the things we looked at earlier in the course.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And this is a good example of how it works with another. So this is Ben again, the ex-baseball player I was telling you about before. And so how this works, it just kind of doesn't matter about gender in terms of the affective aspect here.
Yeah.
So he describes how if he can't bring himself to go to the gym, to not go to the gym every couple of days, because he starts seeing his body differently and saying my body's playing tricks on me, or my image is playing tricks on me, which is another common theme that people have told me about. Yep. You can't get past it. You can't get past as in not going. Yep. And he's trying to maintain the image he's built up. They nicknamed me Hercules. He has Hercules tattooed across his abdomen. Mm-hmm. So it's particularly difficult for me past that identity to be described on your body, I would argue.
Did they nickname you Hercules before or after the tattoo?
Before.
Right. Okay.
So he's trying to live up to this identity and this image that he's built up over 20 years, he says, and that's why he has to keep going and doing it. So it's a similar kind of, I would say, narrow range of affects that are available in relation to this practice, that has nothing to do with health, as he says, but all about the image, which can be particularly limiting. He does sort of say, I wonder how long I can keep that up for, which sort of suggests he's looking for ways to try to move beyond it, to get out of this loop. It's not that Julia and I don't think we'll be stuck in that forever either, but there are ways out, but it shows also why it's difficult to get out of particular motivations around image and appearance that I would argue have a lot to do, are sort of linked along the spectrum of really body image concerns. For sure.
Okay.
So the next ones are about health and health and image in the body, and I think I might go through these ones a bit quicker, because a lot of the main content I wanted to go through is really with gender. But basically health was described in a lot of really complex ways that were much more, so image was often used in there, but it's also about endorphins and the feeling of health, and also about moralizing aspects, about judgments made on other people's bodies, feeling health enabling happiness, all kinds of self-esteem type things. And it was really, really messy trying to figure out how to discuss health, because it was described in so many ways that were kind of conflated as being the same, and the health as representing an image, or seen as being able to be judged on others based on image, is the main thing that I find highly problematic with the current context and privileging of health, is really around those image-based things to do with the current context we have with social media, with celebrity culture, popular culture.
So to kind of summarise here, health is being defined more so by these people as an image rather than a feeling.
Yeah.
Is that? I know that's too simplistic from what's there, but that's kind of the general gist of it. Yeah.
That is definitely the general gist of it, and I would have to really push to. I'd have to say, what does health feel like to get anything other than what it looks like.
Yeah. Okay.
This example is one way of unsettling that link between, you can tell someone's healthy by looking at them. That kind of generalization. Claire discussed how her former best friend, she was still at school when I interviewed her. She was very fit and healthy, but all she ever did was exercise. All I'd ever see her eat was lettuce, and she got to the point where she was becoming too healthy and it was becoming dangerous. So it was like, I use this as an example to show that health cannot be understood as contained or limited only to the practices that seem to lead to health, like that we always hear about from diet and exercise. But and I love how Claire describes it as becoming too healthy. This is anorexia. She was hospitalised. It's so much more important to look beyond those practices and see the context in which they occur, rather than just focusing on those things themselves as leading somehow inevitably or straightforwardly to whatever this zone
there's
of
definitely
health
an inversion of meaning there. That, like, if I was to describe that, I would say she was becoming sick.
Of course.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Most people would. So I thought the language around that demonstrates to me the dominance of health as something that you can't understand it as anything else. These practices, in terms of the obsession and the extreme nature of only eating lettuce, but they're understood in terms of being healthy. Yeah.
Okay.
And this. Yeah. So this next one is also from Claire, and I'll just go through this one pretty quickly. But this is sort of about the regulation of health, I guess, as well. And she would sort of not like the way her friend would be judging how what she'd have in her lunchbox, and this is around sort of the regulation of lunchboxes in schools and gender, because it was an all-girls school. But yeah, so Claire describes herself as having a much more easygoing relationship with food than her friend did, but then she'll go on to describe, the way that she'll strategically manage how much food she has based on what day of the week it is, and if she's got 4.5 hours of dancing coming up that night. So she'll manage her health in doses, and that's because she can see these things as being able to be taken in unhealthy doses, like her friend did. Yeah. So this is around unsettling, the links between the practices and the images, and of health as being sort of something that just, if you do it this way, it'll lead to this image, a good outcome, but it's actually something that has to be extremely strategically managed. Whatever you're doing.
So it's essentially she's saying there that when she knows she's got exercise coming up, she'll eat lots of crappy food because she can get away with it.
She's saying she won't worry so much. Yeah. I know.
I actually think I might do that sometimes. I
know, but it's sort of. I mean, I think 4.5 hours of dancing is pretty. I do that. It's like really intensive kind of exercise. So I'm like, oh wow, you let yourself off the hook because you got 4.5 hours of dancing. That's still pretty extreme. Yeah. And this last example is also about a participant, Isabel, who did unsettle that link between you can read someone's healthy or not based on how they look. So she says that she's sort of critical of this, saying some people might see the skinniest person and say, oh, they must be so healthy. She's identifying that as the norm, but they might not even eat. My friend, for example, she doesn't eat, she's so slim, but she looks good, really skinny, but she also looks a bit sick, but people tell her she looks healthy, but she's got bulimia. So I think it's kind of pretty self-explanatory in terms of how problematic the image and health nexus can be. Okay, so just summing up, basically the main findings I had from my research and the theoretical implications they have. So I looked at the way that gender and health images are really crucial in the way that people make sense of the kinds of practices they do. And particularly images being highly problematic, and needing to find theories that are able to look at the binaristic ways these things play out, but also not understand them as being just somehow mapped into this system that already is made up. Whereas there are so many complexities that are going on in those examples that don't make sense if you only understand them.
So a concern here in a way, in terms of almost the political work that you're doing, is that if you are only to analyse this stuff through those gender binaries, you're essentially reinforcing.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly right. Because the data I got was so much didn't make sense in those terms, even if I wanted to use those things originally.
Yeah.
And I should say as well, I didn't start out using this theory. I had to try to come to something to make sense of these examples, because I couldn't possibly map them onto the kinds of things I'd read earlier. So I just didn't do justice to it. So just as a final statement, I guess, maybe to conclude, I won't go through these conclusions and implications, but the main point is, if we want to understand the complex ways the body is involved in our processes of identity making, we have to look at social context, including gender and health, particularly with the body. And we also need to look at the ways that these things are extremely complex and negotiated individually, but also with social structures.
Yep. And so in terms of those social contexts, so what we're looking at next week, I'm going to look at technical and digital cultures. What do you think? I know I'm just asking for your opinion here, not as much for your research, but like the way that technology itself is playing a role in this. And I'm thinking of things like Fitbits and stuff like that, and the kind of quantified self. So there's lots of stuff in the media at the moment about how this is actually creating a healthier subject, but others saying it's actually the quantified self is actually a really good capitalist self. That you become measurable, all that data that you produce is sold, and that's effective labour and all that kind of stuff. It seems that these kind of understandings of health, therefore, are becoming normalised in some ways through those technologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And measured. I think health becomes something you can measure. You have to take 10,000 steps a day, for instance, to be healthy or whatever.
Yeah, and it's sort of it's almost like a disembodied version of it too, because it's quantifiable. It's not about how you feel when you do exercise. It's about, your stats. And I think this is just kind of a personal view that's come from my research that links in with that, is that the more you disconnect from the reasons you want to do things that are beyond like image, like if you want to go for run because you enjoy it, then great. But if you hate exercising, find something you do like doing, because it's just not going to have the same obsession kind of loop in with it that ends up getting in that trapped situation where if you get injured or sick, your world falls apart because you can't go to the gym or something like that. So I think those technologies can help facilitate the kind of health obsession we're already perhaps being encouraged towards too strongly.
Sure.
But maybe with social media and with the other forms of technology, I think we have the means of critique available to us much more readily as well. Which is the kind of flip side of a lot of stuff we're seeing as well. There's the capacity for critique, which I think is really important.
And for me, that makes them quite ambivalent in a way. But I also like to think of this stuff through Haraway's stuff about cyborg selfers. And I might touch upon that in next week's lecture. So thanks a lot, Julia.
My pleasure.
So as I said, we'll be looking next week at technology and digital cultures, around youth cultures, but also around how they're affecting the way that we think about labour.